So see, we're going to jump right into this. One of the major questions people had is before we arrived in the Shadowlands, we were sort of wondering how does the Arbiter, what her role was. And the big question here is, did the Arbiter ever send anyone directly into the Maw? Or did she always try to send them to Revendreth? Or was there anyone she kind of circumvented and said, no, you're just awful and right to the Maw?
Yeah, that in the time before when the Arbiter was functioning the way that she was supposed to, she would occasionally send those souls that were judged to be irredeemable directly to the Maw. If you look back at that cinematic that we did after you arrive in Oribos, that depicts the things the way they were, the way they were before, you'll see like souls coming into the top of Oribos, and most of them going out to the various afterlives, but there was like a trickle of souls kind of coming out that soul stream at the bottom that were intended to go to the Maw. But like vastly, it was most people were going to other afterlives. And then all that changed once the Arbiter was broken, and then everything started going through that soul stream. And in that cinematic, you see that intensify as she is no longer serving her function anymore.
Right. Okay. Question for you, Morgan, concerning about Torghast. Some of the Torghast abilities are just insanely fun and something that would be crazy broken in the open world. I was wondering if you could tease or hint to any upcoming Torghast abilities in 9.1, or even just comment on any of your favorite, most ridiculous Torghast abilities that you created or maybe didn't actually make it to live that were just kind of too crazy. Any comments on those?
Sure, yeah. Funny that you mentioned that. So when we were talking about the rune carving system, this is something that we introduced with the Shadowlands, where there was this rune carver who actually has a really interesting narrative backstory as well. And as you bring him memories, he kind of like remembers pieces of his past, and there's still more to be discussed there. But something that we were talking about when we were creating these new legendary powers was, hey, we just came up with like a bunch of really cool ideas for essentially cool powers for World of Warcraft classes in this Torghast feature. Are there any of those that we could get onto rune carving? So that's still a space that we're looking at for the Chains of Domination update. And especially as we look to update rune carving and add more legendary powers, one of the spaces we're looking is those covenant specific class powers that you get in Torghast. Whether you're a demon hunter with the hunt. There's powers that really do really interesting things there. And that's one of my favorite ones, actually. I have a demon hunter friend I play with, and watching him just like zip around Torghast as he uses the hunt on literally every creature. I'm like, hey, slow down. Like, I'm way back here. It's very interesting to see what some of the builds that players have come up with that. And, we always look to, as we're updating some other systems, to kind of draw inspiration from those, especially.
Awesome.
I love doing Torghast with a shaman along, because if you get the right power, it's like lust all the time. Just about. It's like every encounter is like boom, 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 hit my buttons as fast as I can. It's just so exactly. Awesome. I love the manic feel of that.
As a prop paladin and constantly throwing my shield like Captain America, it's never ending. It's so fun to watch my shield just bounce endlessly. So definitely looking forward to what's coming next. Steve, there's a lot of questions about the Drust, and in Battle for Azeroth, we learned that Gorak Tul, the leader of this sort of druidic death magic Vrykul cult, reached into the realm of Thros, and this is kind of where the Drust were born. But we hear in Ardenweald that the Drust have been a long-term enemy of Ardenweald. Does the Drust threat that they know predate Gorak Tul and Azeroth? And if so, how old is the Drust as like a cosmic force or as an entity?
Well, as we know from playing BFA, the Drust were a people that were alive at one time when the people who would be the Kultirans first came to those isles and started interacting with them, and the conflict that broke out as a result. So we've gotten some little bits of their history before. So, but it's that darkness that they tapped into that kind of death-centered form of druidism that at the time of BFA, like that was a novel thing, right? Like we didn't think about druidism that way because it's been so tied with the powers of life and the Emerald Dream and all that sort of thing. And then Ardenweald was a natural place to kind of explore that story further. And so we get to see that druidism doesn't have to just be about that period of springtime and growth. It can also be, you tap into those powers of when nature lies fallow, and it needs to, it needs that period of kind of decay that fall and winter represent in the real world, in most places outside California, at least, where you can experience that change of seasons. And so we've learned that that druidism is about more than just life and growth. It's about this cycle between life and death. And I think that Drust went heavily into the dark aspects of that in order to try and win their fight. And that's what Gorak Tul went like a madman into that. And some of his own people, as we've met some of the Thorn speakers who didn't agree with him and stood up to Gorak Tul. So that was just a really cool story to delve deeper into in Ardenweald because it felt so thematic. But yeah, the feeling that the Drust and Thros being one of those places that's kind of on the precipice of the Shadowlands, that's not quite fully a realm of death, but is certainly touched by it. That was a very interesting story to tap into, and we'll continue to have little hints and things about that as the story unfolds.
My follow-up question to that was asking if Thros was an afterlife in the Shadowlands, and you sort of asked that at the very end there. Will we, each sort of realm tends to have a sort of deity of power. Will we learn of any specific person or force from Thros, or was it just kind of a force that Gorak Tul kind of became the prime of? We assume or know he's dead at this point, but was there a higher being he was reaching out to?
There was no other like eternal one that he was specifically tapping into there. Okay. I think it was just that because of them, harnessing that magic with such force, such intensity. That's what really made Thros kind of teeter on the brink there. There's overtones of the nightmare as well, which is, when you think about it, it's yet another variation of that cycle and that balance. It's just the void touched version of that. So Thros was kind of on the precipice of a lot of those confluences, but no, not something that was fully in the Shadowlands. It was just ripe with power that Gorak Tul and his followers were able to tap into to use for some very bad, dark reasons.
Got it. Back over to you, Morgan, for Torghast. Torghast is one of my favorite parts about Shadowlands. As someone who wasn't really interested in the roguelike gameplay, I was amazed as to how much time I've spent in Torghast. And one of the criticisms that's come out of the community is the sort of replayability in terms of rewards. Obviously, the mount and the toys that you get from the layers are great. But in comparison to the island expeditions in Battle for Azeroth, there was dozens of transmog weapons, sets, mounts, cosmetics. Is there any plans or sort of thought process maybe to bring this more widespread reward pool to Torghast? I love spending hours there, but it's sort of a little bit disheartening to leave after a 3-hour run and kind of leave with nothing in hand, even if it was just for cosmetic, not even in terms of power gain. So any thoughts there?
Absolutely. That is definitely an area that we have also heard from the community, given us a lot of feedback on, and is something that we want to improve on. Torghast in particular is a feature that I think has gone through a tremendous amount of iteration, primarily driven by the community. We saw it very early on added to the Shadowlands Alpha and Beta, and there are major features that we thought were going to be in Torghast that were completely revisited and reimagined based on player feedback. Like the idea of a timer, we had heard very strong feelings about early on, or whether or not it would be a keyed event similar to Horrific Visions, where you needed to earn a key to make a run every week. These are things that we have changed dramatically based on player feedback. So the areas that we're really looking at are those, like you said, if I'm in there for however long it might take to do, a layer 8 or, further layers in the Chains of Domination. And, maybe I mess up one too many times, or shoot, I've fallen off those tiny chains so many times that I like had runs end because I just fell off the chain. And the Terror shows up, sweeps me out. And then it's like, well, that was like 40 minutes and I got literally nothing.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, that's an area that other roguelikes we're very inspired by and are looking to, where there are things that you can earn or power that you can gain almost as like a meta progression power as you complete runs or fail a run. You might earn a currency or unlock a new ability that is now going into the pool of powers that you can find within that run. So that's very much an area of focus for us with Chains of Domination within Torghast. It kind of is Chains of Torghast. Anyways,
it works.
Is that feeling that if I'm not able to complete this, I'm still getting something for it. That partial progression. Not only that, but also just taking a step back and looking at completion times. When you think about activities in World of Warcraft, there's that kind of sweet spot we try to hit, whether it be a dungeon that's about 30 minutes or some of these other activities that you've mentioned. And we feel like some Torghast runs, especially when prior to the major nerfs that we did, I forget, a while ago now, a few months back, it feels like time right now is weird. But prior to those major nerfs, it could take upwards of an hour to get towards the end of one of those more difficult layers. So we ended up just taking a huge nerf pass at the entire experience because we felt like, it just feels really bad to lose, and we don't have a mechanism here to make it feel like you can get some sense of progression even on a run that you might lose. So let's take a really deep look at that problem space and see what we can come up with for Chains of Domination.
I'm definitely looking forward to see what comes out of that. As I said earlier, the sort of the replayability of the islands with all the cosmetics. If I could run Torghast for cosmetics for days, I would never leave. I would never see the new zones because I would spend so much time there. Steve, I got a question for you in terms of necromancy. I'm going to use Thoris Trollbane as an example. Thoris Trollbane was dead for quite some time, at least in terms of human years. So let's say he passes on to the Shadowlands and he progresses through the Shadowlands, whether he went to Maldraxxus or Bastion, but then he was ripped back into the world as a Death Knight. How does that work, both on the Shadowlands side, and let's say he was a Kyrian or any Kyrian, for example, and they did become ascended and they cast their memories aside. When they get ripped back to the mortal life, do they still have those memories lost? Obviously, they won't remember the Shadowlands, but how does that work? I know there's kind of a couple questions in that one question, but necromancy is weird.
Well, yeah, necromancy is weird, and at its underlying thing, its function is kind of a mirror to the way that natural life works, right? Like natural life, someone's born, they're in Warcraft cosmology at least, their soul is bound to this body and it's kept there and it's building up anima. And the necromantic version it's just a different power. It's the power of death that's binding them to this form. And so different rules, but like a similar principle. I mentioned in the Q&A about how time really is kind of perceived differently in the Shadowlands because it is a place that's about eternities and it's not about measuring time one way or another. And there's certainly an effect of when a soul crosses the veil that it, because we've encountered lots of people who have been brought back to life after, some of them very recently, some of them for very long times. But we can presume that, according to the rules of the universe, their souls would have crossed the veil, gone to the Shadowlands, and then there's this power that's kind of pulling them back. When someone is raised like that, it's not like a copy or an echo. It is their spirit coming back. But I think of that as, and again, this is very, kind of ephemeral. It's not like a scientific thing that you can lay out. But the way I think of it is that even if that soul is pulled back and it kind of forgets what is happening, or happened to it in the course of the Shadowlands, when it comes back into that body, it's still got that tether to kind of what's going on in its existence in the Shadowlands. And again, because it's not a one for one, like time is not really a factor there. I think you could think of it as like almost a second life in a way for someone who is raised like that, or a continuation with the Shadowlands side, almost like a little bit on pause, or just kind of waiting for that tether to re-kick back in and kind of pull them back, to that fate. Certainly, it's when you think about the long history of Azeroth and the other worlds there and so forth. The number of people who have been raised as undead is nowhere near as great as the number that just crossed over and stayed there. So, regardless of how many players play as Forsaken, for example, in the cosmic scheme of things, undeath in that way is a fairly limited pool. So it's not as if there's this infinite, this vast number. It's a certain number of those tethers that maintain. And I imagine that people like that could get called back and kind of resume the path that they were on. But it's an interesting question to what would happen if things that they did in that kind of second existence of undeath might affect their judgment and things like that. I think
I'm having a mental image of someone, let's say, like Lady Vosh being resurrected, and a bunch of Maldraxxus are just talking to her, and then she just vanishes from Maldraxxus because she gets resurrected, and just this like, where'd she go kind of thing. But since we're talking about Maldraxxus, I'm going to lead that into the next question. We see in Bastion and Revendreth sort of the early steps for what souls go through when they first arrive. Primarily when we first arrived, but in Maldraxxus, it's just a cluster fudge. We dive right into the arena fight, so we don't really see the early steps for souls. So, are you able to elaborate or explain what happens when a fresh soul arrives in Maldraxxus? Do they get to, how do they go about getting a body? Do they choose their body? And the example I have here is Vash arrives, or says she had a Kaldorei body when she arrived in Maldraxxus, but she opted for her Naga form. Was that something she had to earn or work towards? How does finding a body in Maldraxxus work?
Yeah, thinking about the way that Maldraxxus worked, again, before the drought set in, before souls were being funneled to the maw, the way that it was supposed to work, think back to even when the Primus was still there and the five houses were still, they were intentionally kind of vying against one another, but it was a more controlled version than what we see when we arrive there. So the process would have been those souls still coming into that arena, like that was the place. But, imagine the Margraves of the houses kind of looking down into this battle of these new souls coming in, showing what they have, basically, like kind of proving themselves in this ground, and then them say, I like that one. I think that one should come to my house. And maybe they might argue over which house it should go to. And the Primus would say, okay, that one goes here, that one goes here, that kind of thing. And there would be based on what your soul was like. And someone, if they're just like this juggernaut of a warrior, then they probably end up going to the house of the chosen. But someone who is very kind of manipulative or deceptive and uses treachery and guile to advance up that ladder, then there's cases to be made for other places that they might go to. Certainly, things like the House of Eyes might have been a choice, or even the House of Rituals. Some of those, like Kel'Thuzad, we see getting pulled into that. So, and then there's that process of Maldraxxus is very much a meritocracy. So it's getting there is one thing, and it's kind of like your past was important to show what your potential was, but it's like starting a new job. It's like, well, whatever you did before, that's cool, but now prove yourself today and every day. And that's what Maldraxxus is really about, of like the best souls, like climbing that ladder. So you can imagine someone arriving and being given like a very basic kind of form that they can inhabit. And then based on their victories or their losses, getting upgrades or downgrades to that body. We've seen those little kind of scrawny leftover abominations and stuff. And that's like, man, people just didn't work out. You get the scraps now, and that's where you're at. Whereas someone like Draka, someone like Vash, who was able to work their way up the ladders very quickly, they were in the position where they could start making some choices and saying, I want to start shaping my flesh this way. Maldraxxus as a whole place is all about flesh shaping and the resources given to the soldiers there to become the best army they can. So if you're successful, you're given some latitude in order to decide your form a little bit. But again, if you just don't prove yourself, then those choices kind of dissipate pretty quickly.
Gotcha. Morgan, a couple questions on Transmog. We saw early in the beta that there was potential for individual shoulder Transmog pieces, and that kind of sparked a lot of interest in the community, but it never made it to live in 9.0. Is that still on the table? Can you comment on individual shoulder transmogging and if it's coming or not?
You know what? This is a great question. I am going to follow up on this one because I know that was something that we were really aiming to get done for Shadowlands launch, but that one in particular we knew might have, there's a lot of history to draw from with our transmog sets, and there were some very asymmetrical shoulder pieces that were crafted with, never thinking towards, okay, well, am I going to be able to have, this left shoulder and this right shoulder? So I know sometimes that could cause some really bad clipping or some other issues. And that's definitely something that we've heard the feedback. We know people want that. And I will follow up with that. And if Josh can remind me, I will try to actually get you a better answer to that, because I think that is a really cool feature that we know the players are excited about. And I imagine we're still doing our best to make progress towards that.
Awesome. A follow-up to that would be in Battle for Azeroth, we saw a ton of restrictions removed, both with like invisible gloves in the chest and the wrists. Is there any talks of any further development, specifically maybe with weapons? We know priests can't really use swords, or pole arms for casters. Or the big one for me is going to be a joke in the comments, warglaives, and how the warglaives, they're an iconic demon hunter weapon, yet all of the models in game are the most beautiful, elegant. Not the demon hunters aren't beautiful or elegant, but the most iconic night elf weapon in the game. The tri-blade that's been in the game since Warcraft 3 is only wieldable by the banished demon-infused night elf class, as opposed to hunters or rogues or warriors. So is there any talks of weapon restriction or just transmog restrictions being removed or loosened a little bit in general?
Nothing new on that front really to announce today. We definitely did want to take a big step back when we were, developing the Shadowlands. And like you mentioned, there's been a whole lot of progress made there, from being able to transmog your artifact again to,
great change.
Lots of other restrictions that were kind of lifted from, there's so many, I remember gray items that people back in the day were like, this is a kind of a very simple, elegant looking weapon. I really want to transmog this, but it's gray, so I can't. And we have taken a lot of looks at things like that and are always looking to improve that. The weapons one in particular, that one's tough. I feel like that kind of shares a similar space as being able to, as a caster, being able to transmog into plate. Like there's something with the silhouette, with the immediate read of the gameplay that we want to be careful not to tread too much on. Like it's very important for us that when I look at you, I have a sense of what you might be, or at least that it's not misleading, right? If I saw, another character walking around with warglaives, immediately I'm like, well, that's got to be a demon hunter. If it's not, that there's a difference between, some not getting enough information from looking at a transmog versus feeling like I was misled by a transmog for PvP purposes and things like that. So that's definitely something we try to be careful with and are always looking to make changes to, as we know that, how players express themselves is a really, really important part of World of Warcraft. And we're constantly striving to make improvements there, whether it be character customization, adding new options to change the way that you look, and also transmogs.
Yeah, I can assure you that, for as often as topics like this, whether it's the ability for a certain class to get a certain thing, or whether, some gray things could be usable, those same topics come up on the team all the time, because we're just as passionate about the way our characters look as the community is. And so we have all kinds of discussions ongoing on a regular basis about that sort of thing. And there is, very much the intent, as Morgan said, like to give more options when they make sense and when a good time for them is. But we'll keep discussing and working on that front.
Fingers crossed, specifically for the warglaives. That's a big thing for me. So I'm glad to hear, especially with the gray weapons and all that. Steve, I know there is a juicy new book coming up, written by you and Sean Copeland. Is there any little gem, teaser, tidbit that you can just drop right now, just to sort of tickle the lore nerds out there that we're going to go, oh man, I want to know more?
Well, yeah, this book was a lot of fun, called the Grimoire of the Shadowlands and Beyond. It was a great privilege to work with our historian Sean Copeland. We had a great time. He's an awesome friend and just a great resource for the team. So it was a joy to work on this. And the book is written from the point of view of a broker. And this broker is kind of cataloging on behalf of his cartel information on things like, everything from Azerothian funeral rites to some other races, like talking about them, talking about the influence that the mortals have had on the Shadowlands, and giving his perspective on the different realms of death and the events that have unfolded. He makes a lot of mention of how, it sure seems like people from this Azeroth world seem to have a very special part to play in all of this, and how the names of these heroes keep coming up time and again, despite all these other worlds of existence, and Azeroth only being one of them. So there's lots of really cool stuff to dig into there. And my favorite thing that I think you and other lore-focused folks will really hone in on is that there is a chapter at the end of the book where our narrator delves into the nature of the universe and the mysteries of the first ones. And he talks about the broker's efforts to uncover some of those secrets. And he gives what I'll say is a unique perspective on cosmology, and perhaps presents another way of thinking about the relationship between these forces. So I think it's going to definitely be a lot of fun for people who read the book.
Okay.
I personally love brokers. I think they're amazing. We have had
one of the coolest new races in Shadowlands.
I mean, they're just awesome, and I love their personality. But on top of that, we also, when you get to engage with them in combat, and when you find them, like in Zymox, in Castle Nathria, they're all about portals, which, as we talk about things like from an encounter perspective, that's always super fun to play around with, right? Like, oh, you can just teleport, like that's fun. But with Chains of Domination, there's a fantastic opportunity to explore more about the brokers and their culture and their ecology and their history and motivations, as Steve mentioned, as we're adding a new mega dungeon, Tazavesh, the Veiled Market, which is going to be all about brokers. And it's an 8-boss dungeon where actually, I think 6 of the 8 are you going to be fighting in different portions of this Veiled Market. And there's just all kinds of zany areas as you are progressing through here and learning more about the different cartels. You're learning more about, what their influences are, but there's also just opportunities for, brevity and just things that are much more lighthearted, as we see in the World of Warcraft universe. There's such a wide range of, things to explore. And one of my favorite things with the Veiled Market is there's actually an encounter that takes place in a post office. And the post office, because we talk about portals and, they're all about collecting things and storing things away. And, what would a post office in one of these locations look like? I have spoilers, there's probably some portals in there, but, what kind of cool mechanics can we dive into, as well as stories that we would learn from these locations? So I am super excited about that book. To learn more about them, as well as experiencing them in the Veiled Market.
Question for you, Steve. Auchindoun. How does the Mausoleum of the Dead on Draenor impact the Shadowlands, and specifically the Draenei soul magic? We see that their robots in Shatrath and Argus had souls in them. So were the Eridar pre-Legion and the Draenei sort of circumventing the eventual fate of souls? How does that work?
Well, one of the, it's not a major plot point of Shadowlands that you need to understand in order to know what's going on there. But there's one of the things that's kind of hinted at and mentioned here and there is that, the pattern of a mortal existence ending and their soul, being ushered across the veil by those Kyrian watchers. The part of the Watcher's decision point is wait a minute, is there some force that's tethering them, that's anchoring them to the mortal plane, and or some force that's interfering for whatever reason in the the process of this. Like that's the case with like Bridenbrad, who was in Northrend. Here's this paladin who died, and then Naru intercedes and says, "Wait a minute, I'm going to put a kibosh on the process here, and I'm going to anchor you. I'm going to take you to the light, even though your soul would have crossed over otherwise." And so there's things like that with some of the spiritual races of Azeroth, where they can kind of forge some of those tethers, and they might not think of it that same way of like, oh, there's Kyrian Watchers and I'm doing this. It's just through the nature of their beliefs, their spirituality, the powers that they channel, and I think even on in the case of the original Eridar back on Argus, I think same thing. They just, through their inherent magics, they were able to kind of tether some of those souls, tie them to those devices, and at least temporarily keep them from crossing over into the Shadowlands.
Perfect. Quick question for, I know a lot of the role players are asking this, but the portal in Oribos is canonically attached to Orgrimmar and Stormwind. We see Grifta, the necklace seller show up, Talia and Callie arrive. So does this mean that anyone can just kind of walk into the Shadowlands? And kind of a reverse question, can a Venthyr just go take a stroll into the Mage District? Or is there some sort of little restriction with the guards there? Like, people are coming through, but, you can't take a field trip to Oribos.
Yeah, those portals, we always put portals by necessity for gameplay reasons to go to the places wherever they are, and thinking even, back to Cataclysm, some of those portals that took you to very disparate places and all of that sort of thing. So, by and large, the portal rooms in Orgrimmar and Stormwind are meant to be a player, a gameplay device to do that. But that said, we have shown some characters like Grifta cross over, but kind of think of the fiction there as like they would have had to have gone to some trouble to make that happen. Like they would have probably had to talk to the Death Knights, or to get a little help to open up some kind of gateway through there, or maybe mages. Thanks to some of the things that Jaina has helped them understand, maybe they could have deciphered some of those ways. But it's not like the average citizen can just like, oh, hey, there's a portal. What should I do? I'll click on that, and suddenly this farmer is running around the Shadowlands. They could, there's some effort there and some decision making that, like, we don't need to narrativize every moment of that, but you could assume that in a story sense that there's a barrier to entry. And from the other side, beings that are bound to the cosmic realms cannot just on a whim come through. There is, again, something about once you are bound and in those cosmic realms, it takes a concerted effort to be able to cross those boundaries. That's why things like, the Legion invasions, while they've attacked Azeroth many times, it wasn't just, oh, let's hop on the bus and drive over there. It's like, okay, how do we get the gateways open? How do, we need to use the Well of Eternity, or we need to use this temple to Elune and make that into this, because it's this tomb to the Avatar Sargeras and all that sort of thing. So again, it takes a lot of effort for those things to happen.
You actually answered one of my last questions I had there, was the sort of interplay between the denizens of the death and life, because we know, Draka's been to Legion worlds and the Kyrian go beyond the veil. So you kind of answered, how come we've never encountered them before? Well, there is that sort of process that's kind of bound to them. The last question, I don't know if you can give us an answer to this.
And again, I'll just add to that, because you did kind of answer part of it, or I did, but like I would just say again that when we on Azeroth think about so many of these events that happen really in a short span of time on our calendar of from the time the Dark Portal was open, 30 some years before the events of the current game. Like, think how much has happened in that short span of time. And when you're dealing with these cosmic realms, like some of that stuff went on over eons. And so you can imagine that like they could go long periods where there was no interaction, and then suddenly things would heat up and there would be wars between, the light and the void and like all this kind of stuff. And all of that stuff has happened on this cosmic scale where time, isn't perceived the same way as it is on Azeroth. And so, that's just another thing to think about in those spans of time as those forces are trying to move against one another in this cosmic chess game that they play.
Okay. And one of the last questions I had, and I don't know if you can answer this, but it was from the cinematic right before the one we just saw, where they're forging Shalamorn, and the gem that the jailer sort of pulls out of this realm that he puts into the sword. Do we have any idea? It's very similar to the gem that was in the crown. Will we get any sort of lead up to this or explanation on where that gem came from? What is the gem? Or is it just sort of just a domination crystal that was sort of to act as the eye of the jailer or in terms of the sword to transform Anduin?
When we see the jailer kind of move his hand and you see that magic and him reaching through there and taking this crystal out, you can imagine, and Sylvanas, that's something she hadn't seen before. That's not something that she was familiar with.
Okay.
And so that was a little thing that caught her eye as well. I think it's safe to say, without getting too spoilery, that it seems like the jailer might have his own kind of private stock of powerful things, whether those are souls or other forms of power. I guess we'll have to kind of wait and see. But I think it's also safe to say that with as deliberate and strategic as the jailer is, and that his plan is proving to be, that he didn't choose something at random, that he chose a very specific thing to put into that sword, to forge into it. And it is also safe to say that the story of what that is and what it means will be something that we will visit as the story continues to develop.
Awesome.